Hello and welcome to Root Causes, the PKI and Security podcast where a pair of industry veterans talk about all matters digital certificates and PKI. I'm Tim Callan, Chief Experience Officer at Sectigo, and I'm here with Jason Soroko, SVP of Product at Sectigo. How are you doing today, Jason?
Doing great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
So a long time ago, like probably 100 episodes ago or more, we defined a term. It was one of our What Is episodes, and the term was CA agnostic. And we were thinking it would be nice to go back and dive a little deeper on that. And in particular, I think one of the things we've been seeing, Jay, is that this term is picking up use out there in the world. We're seeing it used in the industry. We're seeing it used by analysts. I know it's a Gartner term. And as always, with tech words, the definition might vary based on who's using it and what they mean, right? And you and I have discussed this with other terms as well. And so we're thinking today it would be a good idea to just dig into that a little, talk through the idea of CA agnostic, what might that mean or might it not mean, and give everybody a framework to think about that idea. Does that sound good?
Sounds great, Tim.
Okay.
Tim, let's talk a little bit about the history. It's quite often we start with the pithy definition, right? But I in this case, I'd like to start off just with a little bit of the history. And as you know, Tim, back in the day when the internet first came out, there was no HTTPS, and you just browsed to websites. Sure. And eventually, of course, the concept of having encrypted communication between a web server and the browser just made a lot of sense. And so SSL certificates, which became TLS certificates, which we still use to this day heavily, they basically the ability to put those certificates onto the websites, the ability to manually provision them, manually manage them. This was still a world before certificates were used basically just about everywhere in all kinds of use cases.
Right.
But let's stick with this idea of publicly trusted certificates for this particular podcast, Tim, because this is kind of interesting.
Okay.
As you know, of course, maybe better than most, the vendors of these SSL certificates started to arise. And, all of a sudden, we now had a few vendors and then many more vendors. And then there was all kinds of specialist vendors who were like into specific governments. And things started to get a bit more complicated. And all the way to today, when you now have basically free vendors, such as Let's Encrypt with Acme
Sure.
Technologies and that sort of thing. So it's been a long progression. And part of this progression has also been, hey, it's not just one website. It's no longer even just, one subdomain or just a handful of subdomains. And we've seen websites go down, and we've seen basically the need for certificate lifecycle management. So you have these couple of dimensions here, Tim. You've got the dimension of many certificate authorities, more than one, right? There are a handful of large ones, but there are many certificate authorities.
Right.
And then you also have many places where certificates come from, even if they're not publicly trusted. On-prem PKI was one of the original places where certificates came from in history.
Yeah.
And then you have all kinds of other places now in the public cloud. And we will go through that list of all the different places you get your certs from. And so when you say the word CA agnostic, where did that come from? And it really came from a set of vendors who very early on recognized that certificate lifecycle management was important. And these vendors were not necessarily the certificate authorities themselves who were issuing the certificates.
They were someone else. They were enterprise software providers.
They were enterprise software providers who they didn't even call it that at the time, because they were just saying, well, look, we'll get your certs from wherever. Right? You buy your certs from wherever, and we'll help you to manage them.
Yeah.
And then, fast forward to, 2021, and all of a sudden we have a CA who's announcing, CA agnostic CLM, and that was Sectigo. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what does this mean? And I think, Tim, I love the way you brought it up at the beginning of the podcast, because it means so many things to so many people.
Yeah.
And it's because it is a lot of things. It actually is a lot of things.
Well, and the potential sources for certificates are vast and varied, right? Even a major public CA like Sectigo, we're serving the whole globe. We're doing absurd numbers of OCSP lookups and issuing ridiculous numbers of certs. And there are real world certificate use cases that are out there that aren't in our domain, right? Because what you can potentially do is just so broad and varied. And so one of the things that I think I find is that it's almost difficult to imagine and define a CLM that is truly servicing every kind of source of certificates, every kind of type, and every kind of CA, right? And so you're guaranteed, even if somebody proudly says, I am CA agnostic, it's almost like, okay, well, what are the white spaces in that? Because you know there are going to be some, right? And this is a big thing that CA independence, CA agnosticism. Don't make the mistake. This is going to be my big takeaway for the podcast. So I'm gonna ruin it early instead of saving it for the end. Don't make the mistake of thinking of this as an all or nothing dynamic, right?
Right on.
It is what it really is for every software provider in the world, no matter how seasoned, no matter how accomplished. It's all, where do they sit on that spectrum? It's a big set of shades of gray, and what are the white spaces, and are those white spaces that I care about? And that's how to consider this concept of CA agnostic in reality, because that really is the technology reality, the software reality, not only today, but will be for many years to come.
Absolutely. Another way of putting it, for those of you who are like hardcore practitioners, if you're running a certificate lifecycle management, first of all, bravo, good job.
Yeah, good job.
It's the right thing to do in 2023, and it'll be the right thing to do going forward. And basically, when you're looking at vendors of certificate lifecycle management, you really should be asking yourself, hey, are you helping me to source certificates from multiple different places? And what Tim is saying is not every CLM's gonna be able to touch absolutely everything. That's not even probably a great thing to do anyway. But I do think that with all sorts of work and integrations, you're going to be able to reach out and touch a lot of things, and the list of things you're going to be able to reach out and touch will be greater. And we can't even say that we know what in 5 years you're going to want to reach out and touch and get certificates from and discover and manage and rotate and renew. We're just not going to know all the sources.
This is a moving target, right? So absolutely, right? Part of what like you said, Jay, if you're getting it on CLM, good for you, like good decision. You're going to want to make sure that your CLM stays current with your evolving needs. Because if you can imagine, we could have gone back not that many years ago, and there wouldn't have been a lot of interest in discussion in, let's say, certificates for the public cloud or certificates for DevOps environments, right? But you couldn't possibly not consider those today, right? And what's that going to look like in 5 years? What's that going to look like in 10 years? What are those new things going to be that we're not that worked up about today, but they will be very important to us, for sure.
So Tim, okay. I think what's interesting here is I want to go a little bit of history again, talking about who needed CA agnostic. And I think we all need it now is the punchline. But where was it first needed? One of the original needs for it was, believe it or not, it was consortia who were coming together for public and I would say probably for the most part, privately trusted certificates that were meant to be interoperable. Well, we had concepts in PKI such as bridging trust, right? That's a trust model within PKI, but it's very difficult to do. You see it in federal government, but to LG and Microsoft and pick your gigantic tech vendor of choice, when they want to get together and have their devices interoperable, they were not going to the traditional CLMs. They were going to the CAs. Because of the fact that a lot of times they wanted to have that brand name of publicly trusted certificates. And those CLM players were not in the business of issuing certs. They were just in the business, of managing certs. Well, so they went to the CAs.
It's just so reliable, right?
It's so, exactly.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, so they went to the CAs, and the CAs, they could have just chosen a single CA to be basically the top of the hierarchy of trust, beneath which all the other players would have interoperable certificates. Great. But what happens if something happens?
Yeah.
What happens if services go down? What happens if a company goes out of business? What happens if, I mean, if when you're talking about device ecosystems that are going to last 25 years or more, you want to have redundancies. And when myself, I was involved in consortia and talking about interoperability a lot, we actually encouraged openness and working with other CAs to have redundancy within the trust model. And that was some of the earliest forms of CA agnosticism that was built into systems in the past. And I would say then all of a sudden, Tim, especially with the adoption of things like Let's Encrypt, you now had enterprises, sometimes even small companies, that were sourcing their certificates from multiple CAs just because.
Right.
You might have your, tim.com, your main site, right? timcallan.com, whatever it is. You might have had your branded origin server certificate from a Sectigo, and then you might have had a bunch of test subdomains that you were just going to turn off and on, and you were just experimenting, and you might have just went off and got yourself an Amazon cert or Let's Encrypt cert or something like that. But here's the problem: you didn't have visibility to
bought
everything.
Something from some random CA and retail. Yep, absolutely.
And so therefore, hence the need for discovery within certificate lifecycle management. Because discovery tells you, hey, you got all these certs. Yeah. But then how are you you may want to continue to be operating with multiple certificate authorities. And so therefore,
right,
the certificate authorities themselves in their CLM software, the decision was made to just have openness. We're recognizing I would think that the one of the better analogies is when Microsoft finally realized we cannot ignore Linux, right? Linux was really the software for server infrastructure, and Windows Windows Server had a place there, but there's no way that they were going to completely dominate or completely compete with things such as Linux. So in other words, they put Linux into Microsoft as a first-class citizen. What the CAs have done in their CLMs is to recognize all the other CAs are also first-class citizens within the CLM.
Sure. And there's like two kind of, I kind of think of it like there's two kind of scenarios here. And one of which, this is for public CAs, right? And
public.
One of which is what you said, it's kind of the rogue certificate scenario, right? Where somebody somewhere in the company, I may have standard on something, and I said, we're all going to use Sectigo in this company, and then somewhere else in the company never got that memo, and they just went out and got a cert somewhere else, right? And you still want to be able to manage that. You want to be able to discover it, pull it in, get it under control, make sure it's compliant, know when it's expiring, put some kind of, checks in place so you don't have an outage due to an unexpected expiration, right? So that's scenario number one, and that's big, and that happens all the time, and you and I discuss that a lot. Number two, though, is kind of a deliberate second sourcing exercise, where you say, you know what, CAs have failed. It doesn't happen often, but it has happened. There's no such concept as too big to fail. Symantec failed, right? Yep. And therefore, I want to have two vendors, and I'm going to run 90% of my volume through CAA, and I'm going to run 10% through CAB. Because that way, if there's ever a problem with CAA, I already know that CAB works, and I just call them and I just turn up the volume, right? And so we see that a lot too. And under those circumstances, it's pretty rotten if you can't have your second source sitting inside of your CLM of choice, right? And so both of those scenarios occur on a regular basis. And that's what you're saying. That's what CLM vendors, including the CLMs that come from CAs, including Sectigo, are trying to address and deal with.
Correct, Tim. And this goes all the way back to those old consortia days when interoperability, it just made sense. Why would be, yes, we're competitors, but, we believe in openness within the industry, and it's the only way it's going to make sense. And it makes even more sense as we proliferate certificates into web servers, load balancers, CDNs, just so many certificates from so many places. It's crazy to think that it's all going to come from one place. That was fine 20 years ago. It's not fine now.
Right. Now, this is where we get into one of my shades of gray thing, though, which I think is valid, which is to say there's a lot of public CAs out there. A lot, right?
There's a lot.
And I would bet you that there is not a single CLM available in the marketplace anywhere in the world that works with every single one of them.
I can guarantee it doesn't
Right.
exist. It
Now
doesn't exist.
they can discover those certs. They can show you where they are. They can put them inside of a dashboard, but they probably can't revoke and replace and automatically renew and provision, right? And so you got your two sets of shades of gray there. You're like, if I can discover the cert and put it in my dashboard and tell you when the expiration date is, does that count as support? Well, okay, by that definition, I probably can't support all the public CAs in the world. Or do I have to do that full suite of functionality? Is that my definition of support, right? And then the second shade of gray is if I have, honestly, if you support 3 or maybe 4 major public CAs, you've hit in excess of 98% of the certificate volume, right? So if you do that, then do you turn around and say, well, you know what? That's going to be good enough for almost everybody? Or are you that particular enterprise that happens to want that long tail? And so again, what does support look like in that regard, right? Is it good enough for me to have the top 2, top 3, top 4, top 5? Or do I think I need the long tail? And that's another area where all of it's a shade of gray and nothing's 100%, and there is no all or nothing, right? It's all, where do you sit on that spectrum?
Absolutely, Tim. And therefore that term CA agnostic, that term agnostic is a bit odd, right? But it's an industry term. It's being used by a lot of people. We use it. And so with everything you just said, Tim, it's kind of an insider term. It's not a term that came up with from folks who were the practitioners. And that's why I'd like to repeat the reason why that word is kind of used and floated around a lot. It's because it's the CAs kind of making the hard decision of, you know what, when you come to us for certificate lifecycle management software,
right?
If you want to use, if you want to dual source, as you just said, Tim, if you want to dual source your certificates, we're not going to stop who you're using that from. In fact, we're open and agnostic to who you get those certificates from.
Right.
You're not going to be able to get them from anybody that you choose. And that's simply because a lot of that long tail of smaller CAs, they're not open systems anyway. Yes, they are publicly trusted certificates, but they're not in the business of selling those certificates to you the way the big CAs are. The term agnostic means if you come to a Sectigo, we are happy for you to source your certificate from your CA vendor of choice, recognizing that in today's world, we need to be agnostic to where the certificates come from. It just doesn't make sense for us to dictate that you're going to sole source your certificates from a single CA vendor. We are CA agnostic.
Right. And that, of course, is just public CAs. And as you alluded, there are many other sources of certificates as well. And ultimately, those two deserve to be dealt with using the same methods in the same systems, with the same interface, with the same rules showing up in the same dashboards, etc.
There are a lot of private certificate authorities. They may not be public certificate authorities, but there are a lot of private certificate authorities. And Tim, let's list off some of them.
Right. So MSCA, right?
Right. Microsoft CA.
Or your other internal PKI, right? Whether or not it's MSCA.
Right.
I already mentioned, public cloud, right? I might be getting certificates from, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, right? And I care about those, and I want to deal with those, and I want to manage those, and I want to make sure I don't have an outage or something with those. Certificates in your DevOps environment. Those are all obvious examples. And then there are types of certificates, right? There's not just SSL. There's other types of certificates in the world. So that deserves to be in part of this conversation as well.
It is a first-class member of this conversation.
Yeah.
But as you said, Tim, CA agnostic means so many things to so many people because we have multiple dimensions. We have public-private dimension. We also have, public cloud, internal PKI dimension, and we have the different types of certificates dimension.
Yeah.
And so it depends on who you are as a practitioner. If you are a web server Linux administrator and you're obsessed with making sure that your multiple websites and load balancers are cycling through their publicly trusted certificates, well, your dimension's pretty clear. And you might want to dual source. So CA agnostic means something to you.
Yeah.
But if also you're transitioning from Microsoft CA to public cloud sourced certificates, well, that's a whole different deal of CA agnostic. And CA agnostic means a lot to you as well, because you want your certificate lifecycle management to be agnostic to where your certificates are coming from because of your transition.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are the three big dimensions in my mind. If anybody listening can think of more dimensions, let me know. But those are the three big dimensions of CA agnostic to me.
Right. And so you can almost imagine it's kind of like a cube, right? And you're saying, well, where am I sitting? There's these three different meters, right? These three different axes, and how extreme is my need on every one of these axes, and that puts me in a unique spot in this three-dimensional space. And then I say, okay, that's what I am, and I'm looking for solutions that match what I am. But I'm also looking for solutions that match what I'm going to be, right? So, I may not be. Right now, my scope might be limited to certain kinds of certificates, but I think that's going to expand over time. Or right now, it's limited to certain environments, but I think that's going to expand over time. And as that occurs, or I'm using it for a focused use case, but I want something that can be future-proof for my organization, so eventually it could work for all the use cases. And so that also is some of what you think about when you think about what does CA agnostic mean to me in the context of my environment, my work, my use cases, and my CLM.
Couldn't have said it better, Tim. There it is.
Awesome. All right. So I'm sure there's more to discuss. We will probably be returning to this topic. But I think that's a good start.
I think it is, Tim. Sorry to give everybody the history lesson, because I'm sure a lot of you have lived through it. But I never want to assume everybody's been here for 20 years. There's a lot of you who are new and wanting to learn about this, and so there it is. That's how we got to this place. That's why that term is used. It's not a practitioner word; it's a vendor word. So it sounds a little awkward. That's why I wanted to do this podcast.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jay.
Thanks, Tim.
This has been Root Causes.